Yeah, that's why this is so important. This is one of the fights that we see towards, the against US imperialism. And it's important for Americans to know that because I'm a millennial. My whole life I was taught that we were, the greatest country on earth, that we were, giving people democracy. We were going to wars to spread freedom and protect people. And, you grew up and you realize that's a lie. And you
Right.
don't realize just how far that lie has gone. And how important is it now that we're coming into the 2020 election where we have somebody like Joe Biden who is being pushed by the Democratic establishment, by the neoliberals. And then we have Donald Trump, the neocon. And then we have people like Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. How important is it where they stand on Venezuela to not only to the United States, but to Venezuela and other countries abroad?
Well, you grew up at the time, the 21st century, when it became more clear than ever before that the U.S. was not the good cop in the world. That was the long history since World War II. U.S. is the good cop. We're bringing democracy, we're bringing freedom, we're well, that kind of rhetoric. But in the 21st century, it's been obvious that what the U.S. brings is chaos. We bring chaos, destruction. We bring mass murder. The U.S. has killed more than 1 million people in the Middle East and Afghanistan. We've caused many millions of people to become migrants, having to flee their homes or even flee their countries, which has caused all sorts of problems in Europe as well, because that migration has caused a right-wing rise in Europe. And so the crisis of the 21st century, these never-ending wars, has really put into stark clarity that the U.S. is not the good cop in the world. The U.S. is actually a destructive force. Now, people saw that in the past. Martin Luther King, in his famous Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, the year before he was killed, described the U.S. as the greatest force for destruction in the world. It's still true today. Joe Biden is interesting, and we bring him up with this question as well, because Joe Biden has had a terrible history when it comes to imperialism, as well as to mass incarceration, racist drug laws, student debt, corporate power, Wall Street, a whole series of areas where he's wrong. But let's focus on foreign policy. Joe Biden was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when George W. Bush was president and was the Iraq War came up. In fact, Joe Biden became an advocate for the U.S. invading Iraq, and he used his position as chairman of the Judiciary Committee to help make that happen. He only allowed people from the military, admirals and generals and former secretaries of the defense who favored Iraq, an attack on Iraq, to testify. Those who opposed it, and there were many who opposed it, many who warned that this would be a catastrophe, and it has been a catastrophe, they were not allowed to testify in front of Joe Biden. Joe Biden controlled the message to make sure that people only heard a pro-war message. So Joe Biden has been terrible on that front. He has a horrible history on many issues, even though he looks high in the polls right now, and that's mainly because of name recognition and being vice president or under President Obama. Once his history is known, I suspect he will drop like a rock in the polls. I expect him to be out relatively early in this nomination process. On the other hand, you have people like Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Tulsi, I think, probably has the best foreign policy positions of anyone running. And she speaks pretty clearly on those issues, although she does get pushback from the right-wing corporate media and from right-wing politicians and neoliberals and neocons in the government. So she does get pushback, and it's hard to hold her ground sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But she has done a good job of putting that narrative out that's much more sensible. I hope that she is included in the debates. She seems to have met the standards for debates and should be included. Bernie Sanders, is mixed. I mean, his primary focus domestic policy, and he has talked about cutting the military budget. When he ran for president for the last election, he was pretty lousy on foreign policy, and he was pretty lousy on Black Lives Matter and race issues as well. But he learned during that campaign and is much better now than he was in that previous campaign. He now is in favor of Palestinian rights. He now does not speak at the AIPAC conferences, the right-wing Israeli lobby conferences. He's now talking about cutting the military budget. He's now done some good work on Yemen. Now on Venezuela, he has said the right thing. U.S. should not intervene. That's the right bottom line issue. And he takes that position because of his past history in his early part of his career. When Nicaragua was an issue, he was on the right side of that issue, trying to stop U.S. imperialism there. But he has said some very wrong things as well. He's called Maduro a dictator, which is totally false. As I said, I was there for the election. There was an election, a very well-run election, in many ways a better-run election than the United States has. There are more than 150 international election observers who unanimously said that the election met international standards for democracy. There was no fraud, and Maduro was legitimately elected. On popularresistance.org, my website, on the top of the slider, we have an article about Venezuela. You go to that article, it includes the declaration of the Embassy Protection Collective. In that declaration, we have a section about the last election and why it was legitimate. We include links to comments by the international election observers that show it was legitimate. And so I hope people will check that declaration out in the slider on the top of Popular Resistance. If you agree with it, sign on. Thousands of people have signed on already. Please join them and show support for this collective that we're doing here at the embassy, the Embassy Protection Collective. Please sign on and show your support. So I think it's important to have the election, but I think more important than the election, and I'm not going to support, by the way, I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I'm not going to support either party. I'll be supporting the Green Party because I know the Green Party stands for all the right issues on these things. And I don't think you can change the Democratic Party from inside. I've seen people try that for decades. And usually what happens is the Democratic Party stays corporate, stays conservative, continues to represent the millionaires and billionaires, and continues to support U.S. militarism. And the people who try to change it end up getting changed themselves. So I'm outside the Democratic Party. I'm going to support the Green Party. I'm currently working with Howie Hawkins, one of the founders of the Green Party, the first person to ever run for the Green New Deal back in 2010, almost 10 years ago. He was the first Canadian to ever run on the Green New Deal. He has a website, howiehawkins.us. You want to find out about him. He'll be right on these issues. I know that I'm confident about that. Bernie Sanders said that Maduro is a dictator. That was false. Bernie Sanders said that Maduro shot at nonviolent protesters, killed nonviolent protesters. That was false. Bernie Sanders said that he wants to see new elections with international observers. We already had elections with international observers. So I think Sanders shows he can learn. Mm-hmm. And so I know his supporters have reacted strongly on some of his misstatements on Venezuela, and he's gotten better on those. But I think he needs to keep getting educated. And I would certainly much rather see Sanders than Biden and Sanders than Trump. But he needs to be pushed to improve. And I think a lot of my job as a political activist is not to focus on elections, but to focus on building the popular movement that will create a situation that no matter who is elected, that they will have to answer to the people of the United States to create a feeling in the United States of everyone recognizing that intervention in Venezuela is wrong, that the U.S. should negotiate, not attack Venezuela. And we ought to create that national consensus and then have people who are active pushing that, so no matter who is elected, that becomes the position of the United States. That's my job as a political activist, not to work on political campaigns, because political campaigns really can divert us from our most important purpose, which is building a mass movement that can impact the dialogue and the direction of the country.
And I think we need both. I mean, I think I'm glad to have activists like you that are fighting for like international causes and like against U.S. imperialism, that are letting people know, because a lot of people in the United States don't know about foreign policy at all. They have absolutely zero clue what that is. How can people find out more? How can people get involved in learning not only about U.S. imperialism and how we shouldn't go into Venezuela, but also about foreign policy in general? What do you recommend?
Great question. That's a great question. And by the way, that declaration I mentioned of the Embassy Protection Collective, you go to the slider on Popular Resistance, there's a link to it. Not only do we talk about Maduro's election, we talk about the Vienna Convention and quote specifically from the convention the U.S. responsibilities. And we also quote from the Venezuela Constitution that shows how Guaido's self-appointment violated that constitution in multiple ways, and he is not a legitimate interim president in any way at all. Now, on Popular Resistance, we spend a lot of time on both domestic and foreign policy. We have a very active campaign for a national improved Medicare for all. It's called Health Over Profit for Everyone on Popular Resistance, you'll see a link to that campaign and other campaigns. Popular Resistance is a daily movement news site. You can sign up for a daily newsletter, which is about 10 to 15 stories a day. You get a paragraph or so of each. If you want to get more information, you click on the article and get more details. That's a great way to stay informed. That is a very valuable tool for people who want to know what's going on, who want to understand what they're not being told in the U.S. media or by the bipartisan corporate duopoly of politicians. So I'd recommend getting that daily digest on Popular Resistance. We also do a weekly newsletter. That newsletter is an in-depth analysis of current issues. Each week we look at what the current issue that the popular movements and the political issues that are moving forward, whether it's climate change, healthcare, Venezuela, other issues, and we do an in-depth analysis of those issues so you can really understand these issues in much more detail. So I think those two sources would get you really up to steam on a lot of both domestic and international issues. And when you do that with Popular Resistance, we link to a lot of other outlets. And so when you see stories you like, you'll see where it came from, and that becomes an outlet you can go to for information. On Venezuela, our favorite outlets, I would say, would be Mission Verdad, which is a Spanish language Venezuela-based outlet. It translates easily on Google. When you open up the website, you can have it in English. It's very clear. Venezuela Analysis does a very good job of analyzing. It's also Venezuelan-based. Does a very good job of analyzing the situation in Venezuela. They criticize Maduro as well as support him, but they certainly criticize U.S. imperialism. And Telesur, which was initially funded by Venezuela when it had more resources, and funded by other progressive countries in Latin America. Telesur is an excellent source for coverage of not just Venezuela, but other Latin American and foreign policy issues. They cover the globe, really. So those would be three good sources if you want to start to get informed about foreign policy. I'm not saying you should ignore the mainstream sources. I think once you go to those sources, you can then balance the mainstream corporate sources with other sources and start to understand what the real truth is.
Awesome. And thank you for being here and for giving us a little bit of an insight into what we're doing. And
I appreciate you having me on.
And I love this. This is awesome because a lot of our problems in the United States, a lot of Americans don't realize, is that it all stems from the military industrial complex and all of that money that goes into it. And then all of the regime change wars and the imperialism that happens when we go into other countries, that causes immigration issues, which then come and affect us and the world around us. So it's all connected.
It affects our budget with more than 60% of federal discretionary spending going to the military that should be going to other programs. And I think it's important to understand this. I'll make this final point. U.S. empire is in decline. And this issue around Venezuela, the coup and this embassy that we're currently in, we look back on this in 5 years or 7 years, 10 years, we're going to look back and say this was a turning point when U.S. empire and U.S. militarism began to end, because this is going to be a major defeat for the United States. It's a major era, one more among many. And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to be seeing U.S. empire in decline, because the reality is the empire budget is empire economy is no longer working for the people of the United States. And it's certainly not working for the people of the world. So I think this is a decade where we have to work to bring an end to empire in the most responsible and least destructive way possible, least destructive to people of the United States, as well as least destructive to the people of the world. So thank you for letting me make that final point.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. Did we have any questions? Oh, yes. Yes. We're all good. All right. Where can we find you? One last point. Where can we find you online for people to follow what's going on in the embassy?
Well, the Embassy Protection Collective has a Facebook page. Popular Resistance has a Facebook page called Stop the Machine, Creating a World. That's because we started the page when we were organizing the Occupy movement 10 years ago, and it was called Stop the Machine, Creating a New World. And you can get information there. Our website's popularresistance.org. We have Twitter and Facebook pages that you can keep getting information from.
And any plans for Monday, for tomorrow?
Oh, boy. I've been focused really right now on today. And every day, we used to, before we were blockaded by the right-wing opposition, we used to do nightly forums in the embassy where people would come and speak, live stream. You can see those on the Embassy Protection Collective Facebook page, the previous forums. And we had a whole range of forums on AFRICOM, on Honduras, on U.S. regime change, with a former CIA official describing U.S. regime change from the inside, a whole range of issues. And so we would continue to be doing those if we were allowed to have people come in and out of the embassy. But because that's blocked, we're unfortunately focused on keeping this collective going and continuing to do the work to find a positive solution to this problem of U.S. empire.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Right.
I appreciate you coming on, and I wish you the best of luck. We'll be keeping an eye on what you all are doing and sharing whatever developments happen.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
All right.